In early January 2026, the world witnessed an unprecedented geopolitical event. The United States, under former President Donald Trump, launched a daring military operation deep inside Venezuela. The target was none other than President Nicolás Maduro, the embattled leader who has ruled the country amidst economic collapse, political unrest, and international sanctions. This operation, carried out with surgical precision by U.S. Special Forces, culminated in Maduro's capture and transport to New York. While U.S. officials hailed it as a success, the ripple effects on the global system were immediate and profound. For the first time in decades, a powerful nation bypassed international norms and executed a unilateral regime change operation with full transparency, leaving the world in shock. The Trump administration openly declared that the United States would assume control over Venezuela's critical oil infrastructure during the interim period. This bold claim, unprecedented in modern history, challenged centuries of accepted international law. Global leaders watched in disbelief as Trump stated that the U.S. would dictate the country's economic and political policies, effectively placing Venezuela under American oversight without consulting the United Nations or regional bodies like the Organization of American States. For decades, the international system operated under the assumption that sovereignty and national borders were sacrosanct. Trump's Maduro operation shattered that understanding, signaling a new era where superpowers can operate outside traditional constraints. The immediate global reaction was a mix of condemnation and uncertainty. European nations, long proponents of diplomatic engagement, decried the operation as a violation of international law. Leaders from the European Union stressed that no nation has the right to abduct a sitting head of state without due process. Meanwhile, countries in Latin America, particularly those with left-leaning governments, viewed the U.S. move as a direct threat to sovereignty and regional stability. Governments across the global south began reassessing their relationship with the United States, questioning whether traditional alliances and treaties could still guarantee protection against unilateral intervention. The perception that the U.S. could act without consequences introduced a new level of geopolitical unpredictability. Domestically within the United States, reactions were equally polarized. Supporters of Trump celebrated the operation as a decisive step against authoritarianism in Venezuela and a demonstration of U.S. military might. Critics, however, warned that bypassing Congress and international oversight set a dangerous precedent for future interventions. Legal experts questioned the constitutionality of the operation, emphasizing that the U.S. Constitution and international agreements place limits on executive power, particularly regarding acts of war. Regardless of domestic debates, the reality on the ground was clear. Trump had demonstrated that a former president, even without holding office, could orchestrate an international military operation with global consequences. One of the most significant outcomes of the operation was the message it sent to global markets. Venezuela, historically dependent on its oil exports, had long been a volatile element in the energy sector. With the U.S. claiming control over the country's oil infrastructure, investors worldwide scrambled to reassess risk in supply chains. Oil prices, already sensitive due to global inflation and geopolitical tensions, spiked sharply in response to the uncertainty. Analysts warned that such unilateral interventions could destabilize commodity markets permanently, introducing a level of unpredictability that investors had not experienced since the early 2000s. The economic implications of the operation were immediate, proving that political actions at the top echelons of power can have cascading effects across the global system. Beyond economics, the operation fundamentally challenged the concept of diplomatic immunity and international protections. Traditionally, sitting heads of state are shielded from prosecution or abduction. Ensuring stability in international relations, Trump's operation undermined this principle, suggesting that political leaders, regardless of their status, could be targeted if they stand in the way of American strategic interests. This raised alarms among governments worldwide, particularly those in authoritarian or contested regimes. If the world's most powerful nation could abduct a sitting president without facing immediate consequences, the rules governing diplomacy and global order would no longer apply as they once did. Human rights organizations and legal scholars were quick to criticize the operation, emphasizing the potential for abuse of power. The absence of multilateral oversight or an international mandate raised questions about the Legitimacy of U.S. actions. Critics argued that while Maduro's regime had committed numerous violations against its own citizens, bypassing legal frameworks in pursuit of regime change risked eroding norms that protect millions worldwide. The operation blurred the lines between law enforcement, military action, and foreign policy, creating a precedent that could be exploited by any nation seeking unilateral advantage. Geopolitically, the capture of Maduro disrupted alliances and created a new vacuum in Latin America. Neighboring countries, once reliant on diplomatic channels to mediate crises in Venezuela, now faced the reality that traditional conflict resolution mechanisms could be bypassed entirely. This created tension across the continent, with some governments seeking security assurances from non-Western powers, while others tried to strengthen ties with Washington to avoid becoming targets of similar operations. The ripple effects extended far beyond Venezuela's borders, challenging decades of regional diplomacy and rewriting the rules of engagement in international relations. Another long-term consequence of the operation was the erosion of trust in international institutions. Organizations like the United Nations and the International Criminal Court, historically relied upon to mediate disputes and hold leaders accountable, were sidelined. The U.S., by acting unilaterally, demonstrated that global governance mechanisms could be bypassed when superpower interests were at stake. This has serious implications for global stability, as countries may increasingly question the value of adhering to international treaties or relying on multilateral arbitration. In a world where law can be overridden by force, traditional mechanisms designed to prevent conflict are losing credibility at an alarming pace. Finally, the Maduro operation highlighted the role of media and information control in shaping global perception. From the start, the Trump administration leveraged both traditional and social media to frame the narrative of a swift and decisive action against tyranny. Coverage emphasized the precision of U.S. military operations and portrayed the mission as a triumph of justice. Meanwhile, critics argued that this narrative masked the broader consequences of undermining international norms. In real time, the operation demonstrated that information and perception can be as powerful as military action in influencing global opinion, reinforcing the idea that the rules of the international system can be rewritten in the age of hyper-accelerated media. In summary, Trump's operation to capture Nicolás Maduro was more than a tactical military success. It represented a seismic shift in the global order, challenging the principles of sovereignty, international law, and diplomatic immunity. By acting unilaterally, the United States demonstrated that the rules governing global interactions are no longer guaranteed, introducing a new era of unpredictability. Economically, politically, and socially, the effects of this operation will reverberate for years, forcing governments, investors, and international organizations to rethink the stability of the system they have long taken for granted. The world now faces the reality of a post-Maduro order where might can override law, and the rules of global governance may never be the same again. In the days following the Maduro operation, the full magnitude of its global consequences began to emerge. Governments around the world scrambled to respond, trying to gauge whether they were witnessing a temporary shock or a permanent shift in international order. Allies of the United States, including NATO members and key Middle Eastern partners, expressed cautious support while quietly voicing concern over the blatant disregard for international law. Meanwhile, nations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, many of whom have faced foreign interventions, historically perceived the move as a dangerous precedent. The operation revealed a critical vulnerability: the international system, which had long relied on treaties and multilateral oversight, could now be overridden by a single powerful nation. One immediate consequence was the erosion of trust in diplomatic agreements. Countries that had previously relied on the principle of sovereignty as a protective mechanism began reassessing their diplomatic strategies. Nations with contested leaderships or political instability faced new risks, realizing that the protections of international norms were no longer guaranteed. For the first time, political analysts openly speculated that any regime perceived as antagonistic to the United States could be subject to direct intervention. Regardless of UN resolutions or international consensus, this created a chilling effect, as governments had to consider the possibility of unilateral military actions when planning foreign policy and domestic governance. Economically, the operation sent shockwaves through global markets. Venezuela's oil, long a linchpin in the world energy supply, was suddenly under American control, creating a ripple effect across commodity trading, energy futures, and strategic reserves. Oil-dependent nations faced price volatility, while investors had to recalibrate risk models that previously assumed political borders and international would prevent such direct interventions. Furthermore, countries reliant on Venezuelan exports for agricultural products, minerals, or industrial goods had to adjust supply chains, triggering cascading effects throughout global trade networks. In effect, the operation destabilized not only regional markets, but the broader financial architecture that relies on predictable international norms. The Maduro operation also revealed a deeper geopolitical realignment. Russia, China, and Iran, all nations with strategic interests in Venezuela, condemned the U.S. action as a blatant violation of sovereignty. This condemnation was accompanied by promises to strengthen alternative alliances and mechanisms to counteract American unilateralism. For instance, reports emerged that Russia began offering military support and advisory roles to other Latin American nations, warning them that intervention without international authorization could become a recurring threat. Similarly, China intensified economic and diplomatic engagement with countries previously reliant on U.S.-led systems, highlighting the emergence of a multipolar world where unilateral action is met with counterbalancing alliances. Humanitarian concerns also escalated in the wake of the operation. Maduro's capture, while celebrated by some as a victory against authoritarianism, plunged Venezuela into uncertainty. Political structures, already fragile after years of mismanagement, faced new instability as U.S. forces assumed control over key institutions. Reports of civil unrest, mass protests, and sporadic violence surfaced within weeks, raising fears that unilateral interventions could exacerbate humanitarian crises rather than resolve them. International aid organizations, previously reliant on state cooperation, found themselves navigating a complex environment where the traditional rules of engagement no longer applied. Another consequence was the increasing politicization of military power. Historically, military interventions required multilateral approval, or at least consultation with Congress in the United States. Trump's operation sidestepped these requirements, demonstrating that military might could be wielded independently to achieve political goals. This precedent challenged both domestic and international frameworks, suggesting that powerful individuals or factions could leverage military resources to influence global politics directly. For the international community, this marked a turning point. No longer could nations assume that military action would be constrained by law, treaties, or diplomatic consensus. The breakdown of trust extended into international organizations. The United Nations, designed to arbitrate conflicts and uphold legal norms, was largely sidelined. U.S. officials acted without seeking Security Council approval, undermining the credibility of multilateral institutions. This raised concerns about the future efficacy of global governance, as smaller and mid-sized nations began to question whether adherence to international law truly protects them. If the world's most powerful nation can act with impunity, the incentives to engage in diplomacy or respect treaties diminish. It's potentially leading to a more chaotic, unstable international system. Financial systems also felt the reverberations of the operation. With Venezuela's oil revenues suddenly under U.S. oversight, global investors faced unprecedented uncertainty. Stock markets experienced heightened volatility, and commodity traders rushed to hedge risks that were previously considered manageable. The operation demonstrated that political events, particularly those involving powerful nations, could directly influence global economic stability. In turn, this reinforced the idea that international law and governance structures are no longer sufficient to guarantee predictability in the global economy. Investors, nations, and multinational corporations must now operate under the assumption that power can supersede law at any time. The operation also catalyzed debates over moral authority and legitimacy. While Trump and his supporters framed the intervention as a necessary step against dictatorship, critics argued that the moral justification did not erase the legal or strategic dangers of unilateral action. International observers warned that such interventions could create a domino effect. Other nations, emboldened by the precedent, might feel justified in conducting similar operations elsewhere. This could lead to a world where the strongest nations impose their will without negotiation, undermining centuries of international law and cooperative norms designed to prevent conflict. Culturally and politically, the operation reshaped global perception of the United States. Historically seen as a defender of democratic norms, the U.S. now appeared as a nation willing to bypass laws and institutions to achieve strategic goals. For many countries in the global South, this served as a stark warning. Alliances with powerful nations may offer short-term benefits, but cannot guarantee long-term protection against intervention. The operation shifted the narrative of global leadership, suggesting that influence is no longer based on diplomacy or shared values, but on the capacity to act unilaterally and decisively. Finally, the Maduro operation accelerated the fragmentation of the international system. Regional blocs, once dependent on shared rules and cooperative agreements, now face the challenge of adapting to an environment where force can override law. Countries are reevaluating military spending, defense alliances, and foreign policy strategies in response to the unpredictability introduced by unilateral interventions, economically, politically, and socially. The ripple effects of this operation will continue to shape global affairs for decades. The world is now entering a period of heightened uncertainty, where the norms that governed international behavior for centuries may no longer hold. As the dust settled following the Maduro operation, it became clear that the effects would be felt far beyond Venezuela's borders. The immediate geopolitical shock had transformed into a long-term strategic recalibration, forcing nations worldwide to rethink their security, economic, and diplomatic frameworks. What many had once assumed to be immutable rules of the international system's sovereignty, multilateral approval and legal restraints were now in question. Governments from Washington to New Delhi had to acknowledge that unilateral actions by a superpower could no longer be dismissed as anomalies, but must be treated as potential reality. One of the most visible consequences was the rise of a new era of fear and opportunism in global politics. Countries with authoritarian regimes, fragile democracies, or contested leadership suddenly found themselves in a precarious position. The principle of non-interference no longer guaranteed protection. Leaders were forced to consider the possibility that strategic adversaries could bypass international law to achieve political goals. This fear catalyzed a shift toward preemptive alliances, secretive military planning, and the acceleration of national defense initiatives. Nations began stockpiling resources, building new intelligence frameworks, and seeking unconventional partnerships to counter potential unilateral interventions. Economically, the operation disrupted not only Venezuelan oil markets, but global energy stability. The sudden American control over Venezuela's oil infrastructure introduced uncertainty in commodity pricing and supply chain reliability. Countries heavily dependent on Venezuelan oil scrambled to find alternatives. Energy traders adjusted long-term contracts to account for the new geopolitical risks. Analysts warned that volatility in energy markets could persist for years. The operation had shattered the assumption that production and supply are safeguarded by sovereign control. This marked a fundamental shift in the global economic system, demonstrating how political decisions in one country can ripple across the world in unprecedented ways. International law and diplomacy also faced unprecedented stress. By bypassing the United Nations regional alliances and centuries of established legal norms, the U.S. had created a dangerous precedent. Countries worldwide began questioning the efficacy of international institutions. The International Criminal Court, the UN Security Council, and regional conflict mediation mechanisms were suddenly viewed as optional frameworks rather than binding authorities. This erosion of trust posed long-term challenges for global governance, as nations might increasingly rely on power over law when resolving disputes, potentially leading to a world where might overrides right. The humanitarian implications were equally concerning. Venezuela, already grappling with economic collapse, political unrest, and social instability, faced further disruption as U.S. oversight introduced new uncertainty. Reports emerged of protests, supply shortages, and localized conflicts. International aid organizations had to navigate a complex operational environment, negotiating with both U.S. administrators and local authorities to deliver essential services. This situation highlighted a broader lesson. Unilateral military interventions, even when framed as morally justified, can exacerbate instability and create unintended human suffering. The operation became a case study in the delicate balance between intervention, sovereignty, and humanitarian responsibility. Another lasting consequence was the transformation of global military norms. The Maduro operation demonstrated that advanced military capabilities, combined with strategic audacity, could achieve political objectives without prolonged campaigns. This emboldened nations to reconsider the threshold for intervention and challenge the notion that military action requires multilateral approval or legal justification. While this may be seen as a tactical success, it carries strategic risks. Other powerful nations could adopt similar strategies, leading to a more militarized, unstable world where rapid interventions become common tools of statecraft. In addition, the operation affected the perception of the United States itself, historically viewed as a defender of democratic norms and the rules-based order. The U.S. now appeared capable of acting outside established frameworks to achieve strategic objectives. This shift in perception had consequences for alliances, trade, and diplomacy. Countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America began re-evaluating long-term partnerships with Washington, balancing economic benefits against potential political risk. The US's reputation as a guarantor of stability had been partially undermined, forcing policymakers to adapt to a world in which trust and predictability can no longer be assumed. Financial markets also reacted to this new reality. Investors had to incorporate geopolitical risk at an unprecedented scale, accounting for the possibility that powerful nations could intervene unilaterally in global trade and resource markets. Stock markets experienced volatility as traders recalibrated models that had previously assumed relative stability and sovereign control of resources. Oil, minerals, and strategic commodities became not just economic instruments but political instruments, highlighting the inseparable link between power, policy, and global markets. Culturally, the operation sparked debates about morality, leadership, and the role of power in the modern world. Supporters hailed the action as a necessary step to remove a tyrant and assert U.S. influence. Critics argued that the operation undermined decades of legal and ethical norms. Replacing diplomacy with coercion and might, academics, journalists, and policymakers worldwide began to reassess the foundations of international relations, recognizing that the Maduro operation represented not merely a tactical victory, but a symbolic shift. The rules governing global conduct were now negotiable and contingent on power rather than principle. The operation also encouraged a wave of militarization and strategic hedging among other nations. Countries previously reliant on multilateral protections now pursued independent defense strategies, regional alliances, and economic diversification to mitigate vulnerability. Some nations sought partnerships with China, Russia, or other non-Western powers, recognizing that relying solely on established Western institutions may no longer ensure security. Results is a fragmented multipolar world in which predictability is diminished. Alliances are transactional, and the threat of unilateral intervention is omnipresent. Perhaps the most profound lesson from Trump's operation is that global stability is no longer guaranteed by law or diplomacy alone. The Maduro capture demonstrated that political will, military capability, and strategic audacity can reshape the world overnight. This has implications for governments, corporations, and individuals alike. Planning, risk management, and foreign policy must now incorporate the possibility that power can override principle. For the first time in decades, the global system has been forced to confront the reality that traditional safeguards, sovereignty, law, and institutional authority may no longer offer protection. In conclusion, Trump's Maduro operation did more than remove a controversial leader from power. It broke long-standing norms, destabilized economic systems, challenged diplomatic protocols, and fundamentally altered the perception of global authority. The world now faces a new reality, one in which unilateral action by a single nation can ripple across continents, redefine alliances, and rewrite the rules of international engagement. For countries, investors, and policymakers. Adapting to this post-Maduro reality is no longer optionally, is a necessity. As we reflect on the lasting impact of this operation, one thing is certain: the global system will never be the same. Sovereignty, law, and diplomacy have been tested, and the balance of power has shifted dramatically. While the long-term consequences will continue to unfold over years and decades, the precedent set by this operation signals a world in which strength, strategy, and audacity dictate outcomes more than rules ever have. The Maduro operation will be studied for generations as a defining moment in 21st century geopolitics, a moment when the international system was forever reshaped by the actions of a single nation and its most ambitious leader. If you found this deep dive into Trump's Maduro operation eye-opening, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more videos that uncover hidden truths behind global events. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. The world is changing faster than ever, and staying informed is more important than ever. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.